the work that you've done in seminary with your doctoral work in the area of theology and manuscripts, what got you interested in the Bible?
I realized that I was engaging with a lot of people, Muslims, with Mormons, with Jehovah's Witnesses, skeptics of all different stripes. All of them would resort to some sort of, well, that sounds great, Wes, but all you're relying on is the Bible. That's your foundation. And you can't trust that. All you have are translations of translations of translations. All you have are error-ridden copies. You don't even know if you have the right books. You're reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but have you ever heard of the Gospel of Thomas? And so I realized that that was a genuine critique if it was true. If that was true, I'm staking my entire life on the person of Jesus. And where do I find the information about Jesus? I find that in the Bible. And if I can't trust the Bible, I really have no reason to put my hope and trust in Jesus.
Hey, Andy Steiger here. We are in Egypt working on a new project called Can I Trust the Bible?
So part of the trickiness with the Bible is that we think of the Bible as one book because we have it in a nice single bound volume. But the Bible is not one book as much as it's 66 books. 66 books written over a period of 1,600 years on 3 different continents by close to 40 different authors in 3 different languages. 2 major languages, Greek and Hebrew, and 1 minor language, Aramaic. But you might be asking the question, well, why are Andy and I here in Egypt to talk about the complexities and issues regarding the Bible? When we're talking about the history of the Bible, the vast majority of those handwritten copies, what we call the manuscripts of the Bible, and particularly the earliest ones, come from Egypt.
Almost immediately after its production, the books of the Bible were being copied and translated into numerous languages and spread across the ancient world. This means that the modern English Bible we have today is some 2,000 years removed from even the last book written in it. How can we know that what we have was accurately copied and translated over that time? It was discoveries of ancient papyri in places like the city of Oxyrhynchus that allow us to answer this question. This city, on the banks of the River Nile, was where papyrus was being grown and made into writing material. It was in the garbage dumps of Oxyrhynchus where a treasure of ancient manuscripts was eventually discovered. In 1895, a fresh graduate from Queen's College, England and Oxford, Bernard Grenfell, and his friend Arthur Hunt left England on a trip to come to Egypt, sponsored by the Egyptian Exploration Society. Their purpose was not to find monumental architecture or statuary, which was the purpose of archaeology at the time, but to find papyri. After excavating a number of graveyards and cities to no avail, they eventually discovered here in and around the area of Al-Banasa, known then as Oxyrhynchus papyri. In fact, between 1895 and 1897, over 500,000 papyri were discovered, including every book of the Bible and a number of influential classical and religious texts. I'm here at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and I'm looking at P1. P1 is the second manuscript discovered. The story goes that Grenfell was walking through the desert and looking down saw a corner of what is now P1 sticking out of the sand. What was discovered by Grenfell and Hunt in that winter season was this fragment of the Gospel of Matthew written on both sides that contained the genealogy of Jesus from the beginning of that gospel.
Wes, I think a question that a lot of people ask is if these discoveries in places like Oxyrhynchus are fairly recent discoveries of these ancient manuscripts, well, what were we relying on before then, and could we trust our Bible? I mean, when we're comparing the Bible that we've had to these ancient manuscripts, like how does it line up?
When they discovered the earliest copies of the papyri, really within the last 200 years, what it didn't do was alter the way that we understood the text of the Bible before that. Even though we had these large spans of time in between when the earliest copies or the originals are being written and when we start to, think of the King James Bible in the early 17th century, when we discovered the papyri, what they didn't do was completely blow up how we understood the text of the Bible. In fact, what they did is simply confirm that what we had was surprisingly, shockingly close to the text that we had even centuries and millennia later.
From the time of the first copies down through the centuries, the Bible hasn't stopped being copied and translated. In fact, the New Testament writers themselves were using a translation, a copy of the Hebrew Old Testament books translated into Greek that we now call the Septuagint.
Here in Alexandria, Egypt, at the Library of Alexandria, not the ancient Library of Alexandria, that hasn't been around for a long time, but Alexandria was a key and special place within both Jewish and Christian history. About 200 years before Jesus, the Old Testament, and particularly the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, were commissioned, most likely in Alexandria, to be transitioned out of the Hebrew and into the Greek. The Library of Alexandria, the ancient Library of Alexandria, and the city of Alexandria stood as a focus and an important key point geographically for both Jewish and Christian history.
Although translated into many languages, the Bible is not itself a translation of a translation. Like we see in the example of the Septuagint, Judeo-Christianity has always been a literary tradition that has never stopped copying and translating its books in order to be read. Almost immediately after its production, the books of the Bible were being copied and translated into numerous languages across the ancient world. When we look back at how we actually go from ancient papyrus to modern-day print, the history of the Bible is not some sort of layered web of translations. In reality, what we find ourselves with is a single step, going from the original Hebrew and Greek directly into our Bibles today. The translation of the Bible takes into consideration an amazing collection of archaeological evidence, from discoveries in Israel like the Dead Sea Scrolls, to papyri dug up in places like Oxyrhynchus. Over time, as we've uncovered more of these fragments and manuscripts, they haven't complicated our understanding of the Bible, but clarified it. The documents that sit behind the history of the Bible and the way that we translate them today gives us confidence in their reliability to go from the original languages on our own. Even though we're almost 2,000 years removed from the last book of the Bible that was written, as discoveries are made, we're not getting farther away from the text, but getting closer. This evidence confirms and gives us good reason to trust that our Bibles have been faithfully and accurately copied, and that what we have now is what the original authors wrote.
Hey, 80 here on the streets of Egypt. First thing you need to know is it's been about 40 degrees today. I hid from the sun. I've now ventured back out, and we're on the hunt for some food, looking for some street food. I'm personally a big fan of Egyptian food, but interestingly enough, they don't call it Egyptian food, they call it Oriental food. At the restaurant here, we've got a couple different dishes. Got a soup going on, got some beef bread with some sauces, dipping sauces. Got a very interesting, I think it's a dipping sauce here. It's like a spinach kind of. We got some
It's hard to put into words the horrors that we witness every day during our time here. Entire families come into the emergency department.
It's one thing I've always appreciated about the Bible is it's not trying to hide anything from you. It in fact will note when there is a difference. If it's a word or something was missing in a different manuscript, it'll tell you.
Yeah, a lot of people, I think, when they see that there are differences within the manuscripts, they panic. They think that's a problem. And they see our Bible has been changed. And I would say, yes, that is true to a certain degree, but our Bible has been changed, and that doesn't give us a picture of confusion within the history of the Bible. It actually gives us clarity within understanding the text of the Bible. When we have these differences, the fact is we know that there are the differences. So when you read your modern translation of the Bible and you see a citation note at the bottom of the page, that shouldn't make you panic. What that should do is give you confidence that we have such a glut of information that we're able to pinpoint those things to a very credible and exact level.
One of the things that catches a lot of people off guard when they're reading the Bible is they'll come across a verse that's missing, and that might surprise some of you, something like John chapter 5, verse 4. There isn't a John chapter 5, verse 4. So how do we understand that? Why are there verses in our Bible missing?
Kind of surprises them. They'll look at their modern English translation and they'll see there's no John chapter 5 verse 4. And they go back and it's in their King James. So who took that verse out and when? Well, realistically, it's not about who took that verse out and when, it's about who put that verse in and when. And because we have such a glut of information in regards to the manuscript tradition and the text of the Bible, we're able to pinpoint when those things happen. Because of this, we're able to figure out, okay, a scribe at some point in history, say, wrote what we now have. Because remember, the verses were added much later. They're not original to the text. The chapter and verse divisions were added in later centuries. And so, when we find out John didn't write what we have in John chapter 5, verse 4, but a later scribe wrote that, well, we don't reverse the entire Bible. That's going to mess up all of our Bible memorization. It's going to mess up all of the commentaries that have been written throughout history that do include the verses. And so what we do is we simply put John chapter 5, verse 4, and we add a citation note at the end of the page.
Okay, the earlier we go and the more we look at the different manuscripts, we can see that this was added at this point. And again, we're going to footnote that and say that shouldn't be there.
And the ancient scribes did their own version of footnoting. When we discovered the story of the woman caught in adultery in the Gospel of John, it was missing from our earliest papyri. It didn't blow up the way we understood that story. Scribes all along have been noting. Some copies that we have it, some copies that we have don't have it. And so they're adding little scribal notations to say, we're not sure about this text, we're not sure about that text, but they would include things, even if they weren't sure whether it was part of the original or not. No, we have not 100% of the text, but 110% of the text. Because what that means, we're so tenacious to include everything that the original text is in there. And it's kind of like a puzzle. If you had a puzzle with 100,000 pieces and you opened it up and you found that you actually had not 100,000 pieces, but 100,000 pieces. Once you start to put the puzzle together, you can see where the image is. You can see where pieces were added from another puzzle by accident, or maybe that someone came along and they added extra pieces. Once the picture starts to come together, it's really clear to figure out, well, what does and doesn't belong. And that's kind of like the text of the Bible. Once we put together the pieces of the text of the Bible, we can see this piece doesn't belong, this piece does belong.
That being the case, Wes, why do the scribes make some of these changes in the text?
Well, a lot of them are just mistakes. And mistakes you and I would make if we were handwriting documents. You know, I do this all the time. I do this a lot. In my emails, all my froms are forms, that kind of thing. It doesn't have to be handwriting, but when you're dealing with handwriting, we do make mistakes. The vast majority of these textual variants, of these scribal changes, are spelling differences. Because remember, spelling was not organized or standardized till much later. But if I spell Andy with 2 D's or 1 D, you can still figure out that I'm trying to write Andy. And a lot of them, they didn't even necessarily catch these changes. So the vast majority are things like spelling, our word order. You know, as long as there are particular grammatical and syntactical linguistic clues, we can figure out what the sentence says. So the vast majority of these differences within the Bible are inconsequential and make no difference in the translation out of the original language.
I think a question that a lot of people might be asking is, well, how big are these variances? Are these significant? Are they doctrinal in nature?
Even though we have these differences, no textual variants affect any essential Christian doctrine. There's nothing that relies on one verse that has a question about it in the history of the textual traditions of the Bible.
Most people have no clue that the easiest way to see in the dark is not with a flashlight. It's actually with this new gadget that's taking the U.S. by storm.
Hey, we're here in the White Desert. We've been going in a Land Cruiser for a couple hours now out in the desert. Just absolutely stunning, beautiful. We've pulled over and we're doing like an Egyptian picnic. Our driver here is making us some delicious food. Really looking forward to it. Now, here in Egypt, travel takes a long time. And one of the reasons is because we are stopped once again at a security checkpoint. The whole way along, we've had to have police escorts as we've been going from different cities, and this one is a particularly long one as we're waiting for the police to decide if we can go through, and if we do, we're probably going to need another police escort. So this is going to be an interesting day. This is our first police escort of the day, but we have had many here in Egypt.
So Wes, we have confidence that what we have in our New Testament is what the original authors wrote, and the books that we have are the documents that get us closest to the time frame of Jesus. But it could very well be the case that we just have the most historically attested lies.
We could have what the original authors wrote, like you said, but they just could have made it up. Or they could have been diluted. So how do we know that it's not only the right words that were written on those ancient documents, but that it's true?
Luke goes to lengths to demonstrate that his narrative is placed within an actual time and location. In the first 3 verses of Luke chapter 3, we are not only given 7 historical characters that mark out the beginning of the ministry of John the Baptist, but within these 3 verses alone are 22 historical references to locations and people that have been verified by archaeology and ancient literary sources outside of the Bible. This places Luke's account making sure that readers know he's not merely making up a story, but pinpointing when and where these events actually took place in history. And the Gospel authors do this in multiple different ways, with names, locations, as well as with accurate plant and animal life related to the areas within the narratives they are describing. The Gospel authors get these types of facts right, even when other ancient writers of the time don't.
It's the details that make the difference. The Gospel authors are going to lengths to try to communicate that what they are saying is history. Right at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, in his preface, he says that he's writing up an orderly account. That term, account, that he uses in the original language in Greek is the same word that other ancient writers like Josephus and Lucian use when they talk simply about how to write good history. The Gospel authors, they want to make sure you know that what they're writing is not just important, but that it's actually true. One of the most important ancient writers within this time period is a guy named Tacitus. In Tacitus's Annals, Book 1544, he describes what the Christians are doing and believing in that time, and he says that Jesus Christ was crucified under Pontius Pilate. But he describes Pontius Pilate as being the procurator. Now, that is actually not the right description of what Pontius Pilate was. You know, in 1961, in Caesarea Maritima, there was a stone that was found, which is known as the Pontius Pilate stone, which has the title of Pontius Pilate, governor of this area. But you know who gets the right title for Pontius Pilate? Luke. Luke, in his gospel, accurately describes and uses the correct Greek term for Pontius Pilate being the governor of Judea. This is something that one of the most prominent ancient writers during that time, of which we know most of our information, or a good portion at least of our information, about who the ancient emperors were, he gets this title wrong, whereas the gospel authors get it right.
Our journey through the sands of Egypt has shown that we have the right books that make up the Bible. The gospel biographies of Jesus, included within it, get us in closest proximity to his life and teaching. Its books have been faithfully preserved and seek to give us an accurate history of the events that actually took place. Although we sit thousands of years downstream from the events recorded in these ancient documents, there are good reasons to believe that you can trust the Bible.
Hey guys, welcome to the show. Today I have a very special guest, Drew Hammer. She has written a new book called Hammered, and it's all about her life. She has a fascinating life. She is the granddaughter-in-law of the legendary business tycoon. And she's also the mother of Armie Hammer, the famous actor who was in Social Network. He played the Winklevoss twins. He also was in Call Me By Your Name with Timothy Chalamet, which was basically, that movie was basically a gay love story. And we're going to talk about when she found out that Armie got cast in that movie, her reaction. And we're going to get into all of these fascinating details about her life. Please welcome Drew Hammer.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. You know how I love and adore hanging out with you. So this is so much fun.
I know, and I just love this book. Is so good. Hammered, your new book. It was seriously just like a page turner. I loved it so much, and there's so much in it. But let's start with, before we get into the Hammer family and how you got into that family, let's talk about your childhood, which was really idyllic, and how your parents raised you, and what your father ended up doing in terms of ministry and his company. So talk about how your early kind of growing up years in Oklahoma.
Okay. Well, it really, truly was idyllic. If you could ever say, I wish I had the perfect family, I actually did. And my parents had become believers when I was only 4 or 5 years old, and it completely changed their entire lives. I mean, it shifted everything, which is basically the way it's supposed to be, right?
Yeah.
I mean, when we bring Christ into our life, you had that encounter. It changed your entire life, everything you did, even the way you thought, the people you hung out with. And that's what my parents did. And they had Bible studies and prayer meetings in the house. And I remember as a child, my room was right above the living room, and they would have Bible studies once a week, and they would be worshiping the Lord, and music and singing and praying in tongues. And I remember lying in bed, and I was such a young child, and I remember thinking, wow, there are angels in our home. That's what it sounded like to me when they were worshiping the Lord. So my parents raised us in the Lord, but they were not religious. They just loved Jesus. And I think there's a big difference. You can go through the motions of religion, you can go to church or mass or whatever every Sunday, and still not have a personal relationship with Jesus. And because my parents were never raised in any kind of religion, that literally my dad would say things to us like, Drew, I don't even know what the different religions believe, but here's what I know. The longest distance in the world is 12 inches. It's moving God from here down to a personal heart experience. And when you hear that as a child, and I remember in high school, my dad would say, well, honey, I'm not going to hurt you. We trust you. I'm like, you're kidding me. How can you rebel when your parents say that to you, right? So I was just always this good girl, and I taught Bible studies in my sorority house in college, and it's kind of all I knew. And what a blessing that is. And it's really funny because I heard a podcast with my son Armie, and he didn't quite have the exact same memories of the idyllic home growing up that I did. And I was like, well, wait a minute. My parents were amazing. And why did you do that?
Yes. Well, we're going to get to Armie in a little bit. But and then in high school, you your dad decide when you were in high school, your dad decided to I don't know if he decided to sell his businesses or just kind of put them on the side and go into full-time ministry. Talk about that.
Okay, well, actually, he didn't go into full-time ministry. He worked until he was 86 years old and died at 87. But what he did is at the time, he ended up, and he was both raised extremely poor. But at the time, my dad already owned several homes and developed land and had lumber yards, et cetera, et cetera. And when he felt like the Lord had called him into healing ministry, he kind of made a deal with God, if you will. He said, you know what, Lord, I don't think there's anything wrong with ministries asking for, donations or asking, to give into their ministry, because I always say, the gospel's free. Jesus paid the price, but ministry is expensive. But the way my dad wanted to do it is he said, God, if you will continue to bless my businesses, then I will give a portion into a foundation because I really want to take up an offering and I want to pay for everything. And that's such freedom in that way of doing it, because you don't have to worry about raising funds. And, the amazing part about it is you just can't outgive God. And every time my dad would give money from his businesses, for example, after he made that deal with God, he sold, two men walked into his office the next week and bought two of his banks, and he put a large portion of that into his foundation to start his ministry. And from then on, that's what he did for 60 years, and God just kept providing. You can never outgive God. But when that happened, I was a senior in high school, and I'm, not bragging, 'cause who cares about this stuff? But, I was homecoming queen and in the it group, if you will. And all of a sudden, Tulsa's a small town, and it comes out on the front page of the Tulsa World, Doug Mobley, Tulsa baker, sells his bake downtown and goes into a healing ministry. Well, Tulsa, Oklahoma, I always say, is probably the buckle of the Bible Belt. But when that happens, you're a weirdo, because the supernatural healing, I always say there's different degrees of faith in Christianity. And if you believe for the supernatural, which I believe we serve a supernatural God, I mean, if it says it in the Bible, I go for it. But when that comes down the front page of the Tulsa World, all of a sudden nobody would be my friend. I was completely kicked out. And when you're a senior in high school, that's a very absorbing time of your life. If my dad not have waited one more year till I was out of high school before he does this. But that wasn't God's plan, because another thing happened. You want me to tell the story?
Yeah.
You and I have already talked about all this stuff.
Yeah.
Well, so when it was in the paper at the time, there was the white pages. We didn't have cell phones or anything like that. And people started, I know, isn't that terrible?
The white pages, I love it.
I know, right? And people started calling my dad and asking him to come pray for them to be healed. And one night, it was a snowy night, and my mother wanted to stay home with my younger sister. And he came to me and he said, hey, Drew, will you come with me to pray for this woman? She's single, lives alone, and it's not proper for me to go into her house by myself. And, I was like, oh, whatever, okay. Because I'm just not having it at this point. Not that I didn't believe it, but it just didn't fit into my social calendar, if you know what I mean. So we drive out, and it was a snowy night. And when I tell this story, a lot of people look at me like I have three eyes or something. But it's kind of one of those stories. It's like, well, why would you ever make up something like that? It's so supernatural that you'd be a crazy person. What happened was, this woman's home, in a trailer park, and you could tell that she literally was down to her last days. And I remember walking in to her home and thinking, wow, it smells like death. Well, I had never smelt death before, but I just innately knew that she was very close to death. And what she told my father was that the doctors literally said the cancer's all throughout your body. And, you know, cancer research was not what it was, I mean, what it is today.
Hmm.
So they basically sent her home to die. And she was completely bald. She weighed probably 80 pounds, skin and bones, and she was gray. And my dad said, well, do you know Jesus as your Lord and Savior? Because that's your first miracle and that's eternal. And she said, yes, I do. And then my dad asked her, do you believe Jesus can heal you? And she said, yes, I believe so. So we laid hands on her and my dad started praying. And I opened my eyes, Beckett, and I literally saw her hair grow out of her head. And I know, right? I
Wow.
mean, it's one of these things where, but you know what, Beckett, if you really think about it, why would we ever limit the creator of the universe? You know, so many people could put God in a box. Oh, he doesn't heal today. All the gifts of the Spirit are not for today. You know, they all went away when the disciples died. And I'm like, well, where did that come from? Because all I know is Jesus says, greater things, not even the same, greater things will you do because I will send back the Holy Spirit. And then he commissioned us, go out into the world, spread the gospel, lay hands on the sick and they will recover, and rebuke the demons and they must flee. Well, you know, I take God at his word. And if he says it, I'm going for it. But I needed to see that. So when I saw that, the Lord spoke to me and said, I'm going to send you into a very big world. Don't ever deny my power.
Wow. Well, let's talk about that big world. So, how did you meet
That
Michael
was a good segue, wasn't
That was
it?
a good. How did you
I just
meet?
teed you right
Yes,
up on
you
that
teed
one.
me up. How did you meet Michael Hammer, the grandson of the legendary Armand Hammer? How did you guys meet? Because he lived in California, you lived in Tulsa. How in the
right.
world did you guys meet?
Exactly. That had to have been God. So when Michael, he went to Columbia and got his MBA, and after that he worked on Wall Street, and Armand called him because Armand only had one child. His name was Julian, who, you know, well, let's just say I never met or even knew people existed like Julian in this world. He was basically a mess. And he was the only child of Armand, and then Julian had Michael, and then Michael's sister. And what happened is when Michael was working on Wall Street, Armand called him one day, and he said, you're basically all I've got. So I want you to come work at Occidental, and I want you to learn the ropes, and I want you to see what I do with my foundation, because someday you'll be taking, you know, the foundation over. And Armand sent Michael to all the offices around the world for 2 years. He lived in London and Oman and all over the world. And would you believe his last stop was Tulsa, Oklahoma, because they had bought City Service, which was the domestic side of Occidental Petroleum. And that's the company that Armand started. So he was there only for 3 weeks. And I had gone down to Houston to play in a mixed doubles tennis tournament. And he walked on our plane in Dallas. And the funny thing is, well, the God thing is we lost in the semifinals. So we took an earlier flight back. It was Labor Day weekend. And Michael missed his flight and got the last flight to Tulsa that evening. And he walked on the plane. And I was like, wow, it was honestly one of those crazy love at first sight, if you will. And obviously he was interested too. God orchestrated it to where a woman switched seats, if you can believe it, and he ended up sitting next to me. So the three of us were talking, and afterwards he came up to me and he said, well, this is kind of the bad part, and I have to admit, I was dating John, my doubles partner, but it was nothing serious. And he said, well, is that your boyfriend or fiance? And I go, oh, heavens, no. Isn't that awful? I know, I'm such a bad person. And he said, well, may I take you to lunch tomorrow? And I said, I would love that. So we go to lunch. And of course, immediately I start telling him about Jesus, because that's just who I am. And by the way, why waste your time? If they're not
What was his reaction to this?
well, this is the amazing part, is when I started talking to him about Jesus. You can tell if people are actually listening or if they're humoring you.
Yeah.
And he was listening. And after I told him how I was raised in this amazing, godly Christian family, and that I invited Jesus into my life at 5, and that I would never be with anyone who didn't believe in Jesus like I do, because we'd be unequally yoked. You know, I went through the whole spiel that you go through. And he kept listening. And afterwards, he goes, "Wow, can I tell you something?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "My grandmother, Olga, she was a Russian baroness, and she was a Russian Orthodox, and she loved Jesus. And she had a home in Laguna. And Michael would go down and stay with her for several weeks every summer. And she always talked to him about Jesus. And she even had crucifixes around the house. And he said, my grandmother and I would kneel down and pray before we went to bed at night. And we would pray before meals. And he said, Drew, it's the only place in my life where I ever felt safe. And we realized it was the only Christian influence he had had in his life, which is interesting because as a child, you may not cognizantly know that it's because of Jesus, but he just knew he felt safe there. And she died when he was in the 7th grade, and he said it broke my heart because his life with his parents was very chaotic and a lot of fighting, violence, the whole thing. And he said it broke my heart when she died because I used to lay in bed and think, gosh, I wish I could run away and just live with my grandmother. So when you were talking to me about Jesus, Drew, I felt that same safe feeling that I felt when I was with her as a child. So isn't God amazing how he prepared Michael, if you will?
Wow.
Send
And
it to
so,
me.
what was it like? So, and then you guys obviously decided to get married. How
Oh,
long?
we were engaged in 3 weeks and married in 4 months. I know, it was just one of those crazy. I'll never forget when he actually proposed to me. We were in Midland. We had to go down there for an oil deal, and he had an aunt and uncle that lived there, so we went down there and stayed with them. And it was so funny because we were driving to a restaurant one night, and he stopped the car. You know, not exactly the most romantic way of doing this, but he says to me, he says, Drew, I am madly in
Chandiya
love
highway
with
ba?
you. Will you marry me? And I answered him and I said, well, what took you so long? We go back. I mean, it's like, are you kidding me? I go 3 weeks. But you know, it was right. And the interesting thing is Michael was very because he came from a very abusive background. His father was an alcoholic, addicted to prescription drugs, and he abused Michael in every way, if you will. And he suppressed it. And I didn't know enough coming from my little Pentecostal background. I just thought you go to church and pray about it when you have problems. I wish I knew then what I know now. We should have been in years of Christian counseling, not because we didn't have a great relationship. I tell everybody I had a fabulous marriage. Well, he just had a better time than I did. But
Yes, we'll get to that in a minute, but go ahead.
yeah, well, you know, it is what it is. But actually, I had people ask me, well, do you think you missed that wasn't the person God had for you? I go, heck no. We had a fabulous life and a fabulous marriage, and I have 2 sons that I love more than life itself. And the thing is that's why my book is hammered, because every heart has been hammered. But God never fails us. People fail us. And when we've been hammered by life, that's when God does his greatest work. He comes in and he restores us. He restores our joy, our peace, in every way he does.
And so, what was it like when you first kind of entered into this whole Hammer family? What was that like, entering this new world, coming from
Oh my
Tulsa,
gosh.
Tulsa, Oklahoma?
Right? Oh, I was Ellie Mae Clampett from the Beverly Hillbillies. Are you kidding? I mean, I two-stepped on the weekends, but I will say one of my claim to fame is Garth Brooks was the local band, and we two-stepped to him every weekend in college because I was
That's
dating
hilarious.
ranchers, and I know. So I was very unprepared, to be perfectly honest. And I also marveled at how happy people seem to be. Because in your mind, if you don't, I mean, we grew up having money. My parents were extremely conservative, and they believed that you are blessed to be a blessing. And their money was a tool that God had given them to go help others. So we never lived an opulent life. We lived very humble lives. As a matter of fact, my dad was so humble that he would buy a new car every year, but he'd always make sure he bought the same kind and the same color so nobody knew he had a new car. And I'm like,
I
Dad,
love
I
that.
don't think anybody cares if you have a new car or not. But anyway, we'll move on from that. But I get thrown into this crazy, crazy world. And I thought I had landed in the Twilight Zone. But God had a plan. He just did.
And then I think the first meeting you had with Arm and Hammer, Michael's grandfather, he took you. He said he asked to, after dinner or whatever, he asked you to come into his office, and he wanted a conversation. He wanted to make a request from you. Tell us about that, and then your request back to him.
So you already know these stories.
Well, I haven't seen from this book. Yes.
Well, that's true. That's true. Well, we covered a lot that night.
黄标，哎
Well,
呦
it，was really
我操，我
funny
看成
because
陈
I'm
标了，我
not
看。
sure, that I really even knew the extent of what I was getting into because we didn't have Google or you couldn't look that stuff up. And personally, I thought, well, Arm & Hammer, probably baking soda. And I knew he was in the oil business, but I really didn't know that much. So we go over his house for Christmas, and I'm used to the Norman Rockwell Christmas, and we have matching monogrammed flannel Christmas pajamas every year, and we bake cookies, and we go down to church and have a Christmas Eve service, candlelit, and the whole thing.
Oye,
And
no
I
me
remember
llames.
we flew to LA after we were engaged to spend Christmas morning with Armin and his family. There's only 5 of them. So we walk into his house, and there's a limousine as long as his house out front, and we walk in, and there's a man in a tuxedo playing a grand piano in the living room, and there were 5 people. So I kind of start looking around thinking, well, I wonder who else is coming. I mean, they have entertainment here. I mean, that just didn't make sense to me. And then it was like a huge tub of Russian caviar and Russian vodka on the table, and they sat there and small talked. Wow, because my family, we get down to the nitty gritty. I mean, we're all over. We're all into everybody's business, I guess you could say. And it was very obvious to me that they didn't even really know each other. It was pleasantries and niceties, if you will.
Yeah.
And we go into the dining room,
这
and
是
he
中国人吧？
rings the bell, and the staff comes in in their organza aprons and their black, tuxedos. And, I'm thinking, okay, this is the weirdest thing I've ever seen in my life. And we go, and Beckett, do you remember those 1940s movies where the dining room table is so long that you can't even touch the people next to you? That would be it. And all of a sudden, he rings the bell again, and this procession comes out with huge silver trays with the the big silver domes over it. And I'm thinking, you've got to be kidding me. And we exchanged pleasantries again at dinner. And then Armin came up to me and said, I would really like to visit with you in my office. Well, I look back and I say, thank God, I really didn't know who he was because, I would have been like, you've got to be kidding me. What are we going to talk about? But I was like,
And you were, how old were you? Okay, so then you were a kid, and you go into Arm & Hammer's office, and what happened?
Well, I walked in and I started laughing, and he looked at me and he said, what's so funny? I said, you have a private library in the Jewish business. I just thought that was the funniest thing in the world. It's like, who does that, right? Well, he seats me in front of his desk, and he said, what are your hobbies? And I said, well, I grew up playing phone. And he called somebody on Christmas Day, and he said, my new daughter she's a tennis player, so I'd like for you to get her a membership at Riviera Country Club. Click. And I'm like, this man has a backbone. Are you kidding me? And I think
And Riviera Country Club is not easy to get into, by the way.
no, and I think I had it within a week. I mean, I don't know how it happened. I guess executives at Oxy were on the board. Who knows? But I was in. So I'm thinking, wow, I should have asked for a lot more, right? Just kidding. So then he says to me, I'd like to ask you a favor. And I said, okay. He said, my grandson, I want him to start traveling the world with me and learning the businesses inside and out and how I run my foundation. And I think it's best that married couples stay together. So I'm going to ask you not to work because I want you to have the ability to travel with him. And I'm sitting there, and again, thank God I didn't really understand who he was. And I leaned in and I go, is that a trick question?
I get to
he
travel the world and
I'm like,
on private planes.
Let me
Yeah.
think about this one. I'm gonna need a week, right? So I was like, oh my gosh. Well, when I leaned in and said that, he started laughing because I don't think anyone ever spoke to him like that. Here's this naive 23-year-old pipsqueak that really doesn't know who he is. And I'm like asking him if it's a trick question. And I just think he got a kick out of me from then on because A, nobody ever talked to him like that. And, you know, I'm thinking, well, he's a 5'6" man. I could beat him up if I had to. Why is everybody so afraid of him? You know, everyone was, you know, always kind of walking on eggshells. But anyways, so I said, okay, I'm happy to do that, but I have a favor to ask of you. I mean, can you imagine? I look back and I'm like, you are ridiculous. I said, I would like to ask you something. And he said, well, what would that be? I said, Dr. Hammer, I would like to invite you to our home every Sunday that you're in town because my family, we have Sunday supper. So I'm inviting you to our home because I'd like to teach you how to be a family. Now I just cringe every time I think about it. I just
And what you mean by your home, you mean your home in LA with Michael. Right.
We didn't even have a home at the time.
I know. I'm just so it's not confusing to people. You weren't inviting him to your home in Tulsa with your family.
No,
you were inviting him. Okay.
Yeah, get on that jet of yours and fly to Tulsa on Sundays. But the funny thing about it is he started really slowing down in his late 80s. He died at 91. And I'm telling you, every Sunday he was in town, he would have Andy, his limo driver, bring him, drive him to our home on Sundays. And a couple of the times he'd like stay all day. He'd like take a nap in a lounge chair. And Michael and I were like, well, I wasn't think we were going to leave. I mean, I don't know. But he became a family. And I think he loved it so much because I always say this, is when you are as successful as Armand was in life, you're not home at 5 o'clock to go to your son's baseball games. You know, you're not around family. You're traveling the world. And I was able to show him a family. And I think he absolutely loved it. And there's that hilarious story in my book, Hammered, where all these toys filled in his limousine. He would have Andy take him to the toy store before they came. And I said to him one time, I called him Boompaw because the kids couldn't say Grandpa, so we all called him Boom. They said Boompaw. I said, Boompaw, when you come, you don't need to bring gifts. You are the gift to us. And he looked at me and he said, I don't bring them for the boys. I bring them for me. Isn't that interesting? And one time he comes around the corner for the Sunday brunch, and there is a kiddie pool tied on top of his limousine with ropes going through the window. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. Is that hilarious?
I love that.
I know.
And so you obviously, when you got involved and married into this family, you started traveling the world. You met all kinds of people all over the world, powerful people, politicians, Princess Di. I want to talk about Princess Di because you You met her a few times, and I think the last time you met her, and then you wrote her a letter, which we'll talk about. But the last time you met her, you shared Jesus with her. Like, tell us about that.
Well, the first time, couple times I met her, we were at like polo matches, and you don't really get a chance to visit much. It was mostly, as I said, with the Hammer family, pleasantries.
Mhm.
And I understood because she was so betrayed. She couldn't really confide in anybody. And why would she confide in me, anyways? She didn't really know me. I was an acquaintance to her. But when you're at these events and it's, say, at the time, $50,000 a plate or $100,000 a plate, you're not going to get a bunch of 20-year-olds in there. They're all in their 70s, 80s. So they tended to group us together because we were both having sons the same time and we were the same age. And we just kind of exchanged pleasantries. Oh, isn't it wonderful raising our two sons? That kind of thing. But the third time that I met her, we were in Washington, D.C., and it was an event for, I believe, the Washington, D.C. Opera. And they had a VIP section, and there were only like 30 of us in there. And that's only because, again, we were riding on Armin's coattails. And Armin's wife had just died, so he asked if we would go to this event for him. And we're like, heck yeah. So we go, and she walked right up to me, and she said, hello, Drew. And I had that brief moment where I'm like, this is the weirdest thing in the world, that Princess Di just walked up to me and knows my name. I mean, it was just one of those, like, this is so weird. And, I guess I curtsied. I don't know what I did. And she said, I just wanted to tell you that I'm so sorry about Frances's passing. She was such a lovely woman, and she was always so kind to me. And then she leans into me and kind of looks around to make sure nobody's listening. And she goes, did you get the jewels? And I started laughing. I said, now, Princess Di, I said, you have a vault of royal jewels. Why would you even think about Frances's jewels? And she says, oh no, nobody had jewels like she did. I said, well, actually, I did, but I'd like to say something. I said, do you know what she took with her? None of her jewels. I said, when she lived on this earth, she loved Jesus, and she invited Jesus into her heart as her Lord and Savior. And that is all she took with her. So all this stuff around here, I said, nobody goes to heaven with a U-Haul. And she started laughing. I said, so you know what? I would recommend, thinking about inviting Jesus into your heart as your Lord and Savior. Because I thought, you know what? I mean, wherever we are, we're supposed to bloom. And by the way, she was not any more important than anyone else who ministered. Everyone's the same nowadays, but I kind of laugh because my son, I started ministering at the Los Angeles Dream Center and going down and working with, human trafficked victims and women out of prostitution and drug addiction and off the streets. And my sons laughed and they said, well, Mom, you finally found a group of women who will listen to you. Because I'd go all over Beverly Hills telling everybody, and very few of them went for it. So I usually just ended up leading their housekeepers to Jesus. And guess what? They're every bit as important, right?
Yeah, of course, of course. So what was her response when you said that to her, Princess Di?
You know what? She didn't say much of a response. She just kind of looked at me and smiled. And again, I don't think she would have ever gotten into it because anyone would have loved to go to the press. Oh, Princess Di said this, and we had this conversation. She was so betrayed, and you don't know who you can trust in this life. But that gets down to what you had mentioned, reading about the letter that I sent her. So when it all came out that their marriage was crumbling, it was like, I think 4 years later, the same thing was happening in my marriage. I found out about infidelity 7 years in, and I was so broken. And I think I was an exercise anorexic because I felt like that was the only thing I could control in my life at that time. and I would run marathons, and I did everything to excess. And, you know, I was skin and bones, and she had eating disorders that came out, and she was going through the same infidelities in her marriage. And I was praying for her. Not that we're friends, but I just had her on my heart because I knew what she was going through in a very small extent. Because what she was going through was in the press all over the world. At least mine was more in the house, if you will.
Yeah.
So the Lord put on my heart to write her a letter. And I'm like, well, that's just ridiculous. That can't be the Lord. I mean, why would she care about, or how would she even get a letter from me? But I had her direct mailing to go straight to her assistant. I didn't sleep for 4 days because God kept saying to me, write her a letter and complete the conversation. And I fought it, and I fought it. One night I was exhausted, and I got up in the middle of the night and I said, okay, God. And if I tell you, I honestly cannot even tell you what was in that letter. Like, you know, I understand small ways what you're going through, but I want you to know that the same heartache. And I told her how this is the time to turn to Jesus, and he will be there for you, and he will carry you, and he will heal your heart, and he loves you. And I just walked through the plan of salvation with her. And, you know, it's so so I go, and you have to buy an overseas stamp at the time. So I can imagine the postmaster, and it says, you know, Your Royal Highness, Princess, whatever the title is. And I'm sure he's thinking, oh my Lord, this is like a child, you know, writing a letter to Santa Claus.
Yeah.
So I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so embarrassing. But I'm telling you, I mailed that thing off, and I had such peace. And that night I slept like a baby. It was so amazing. So I guess the key there and the takeaway is when God asks you to do something, you know, you better do it, or you might end up in the belly of a whale.
Exactly. Exactly. I always say that. But so you, I think you mentioned this in the book that when she was in the fatal crash in 1977, that you think God spared her because she was alive for I don't know how much longer, 8 hours or
Right.
something. And so you think maybe in that time she may have had a moment of being able to accept Christ, or right? Is that
Well,
correct?
yes, that's absolutely correct. And by the way, it isn't, again, it isn't just Princess Di. You know, Jesus says, I leave the 99 to
Mm-hmm.
go after the one. And it says in the Bible that he gives everybody the opportunity to accept him. So when she was in that accident, it's one of those moments where you remember where you are. We were living in the Cayman Islands. And I remember praying, going, God, because they said that she was not dead when the ambulance came, that she was still breathing and alive. And I just kept praying, God, your words will never return void. And I just kept praying that God, even that letter, and by the way, I'm not pretentious enough to think I'm the only one that ever talked to her about Jesus or wrote her a letter, but there couldn't be a whole lot of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I just kept praying and saying, God, you leave the 99 for the one, and she did not die immediately. And I pray that your words, as you promise, will never return void in her life. And I just happen to believe that she's in heaven,
Well, that would be amazing if when we get to heaven, if Princess dies there, that would be awesome.
right?
And so you mentioned, so you were going through a divorce, or you were going through infidelity with Michael. So
Yes.
Michael cheated on you, and I think 7 years into your marriage, and you
Yes.
ended up forgiving him,
Yes.
and you worked, everything worked out until this
Until it
dream,
didn't.
until it didn't. Talk about this dream you had, and then how you confronted Michael later.
Okay. Well, so for 19 years, well, let me back up just a little bit. 7 years in, I found out about infidelities. And I believe in forgiveness. And the Bible even says, if you have something against someone else or them against you, go to them so that your Father in heaven can forgive you. Well, I don't know about you, Beckett, but I need forgiveness every day because I walk into place and I'm like, okay, who decorated this place? Now, this is a person talking with hot pink and lime green Drewville in the background, so it's not a very good example.
By the way, we'll get into that. I mean, your
Yeah.
accidental career where you
Yeah.
ended up transforming and renovating beautiful homes in Beverly Hills, all over the place. So we'll get into that in a minute, but go ahead.
Okay, so 7 years in, I was heartbroken, but also he was repentant. And repentance is turning 180-degree direction, going the opposite direction, never to return. That's true repentance.
Yeah.
And that's what I believed. But I'm also tough. And I said to him, oh, I forgive you. A, this is what I'm called to do before God, and I need forgiveness all the time. B, I love you. C, I want a father for my children. I do not want my children growing up without a father in the home. It's the most difficult job in the world to be a single mother, because there's just something about a heavy of a father of, well, when your dad gets home type of deal
Yes.
that just puts the fear of God in them. So I really, truly believed that for 19 years after that he was totally faithful to me. And 25 years into our marriage, I started having all these health issues. And I think it's really interesting because I believe that sometimes our spirit man knows things that our physical mind has not quite caught up to yet.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's this kind of knowing, but not a knowing. And my body started falling apart. And I thought, well, I'm 49 and my husband's kind of irritating me. So I must be going through menopause. I mean, it just kind of made sense to me. So I went to a doctor and he took blood work and he called me back when the test results came back. And he said, I need to see you personally in my office. And I'm like, oh, great, I'm dying. So I go down and he said, what in the world is going on in your life? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you're anemic. Your body temperature is running at 92, yada, 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 all these other things. Your thyroid has shut down. And he said, every one of these symptoms is due to severe stress. So you need to go home and meditate. And I said, well, I pray to Jesus. He said, okay, well, go home and do that because you need to figure out what's going on in your life. So on the car ride home, I'm going through a list. I'm like, okay, so when people have severe stress, it's financial struggles, it's problems in your marriage, it's illnesses and family members. I'm going through the list and I'm going, no, 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 no. So that night when I went to bed, I prayed and I said, God, obviously my spirit man knows something that my physical man does not know, and I need you to reveal it to me. Well, I'll let you read it in my book. That'll make people go buy it because all the proceeds go to help single mothers. So it's not for Drew Hammer. This is to help single parents that are really struggling raising their children, the proceeds from the book. So anyway, I had this horrific dream that I knew that infidelities were back in our marriage. So that night I approached him and I said, well, we can handle this two ways. You can lie about it and deny it, but I hear from the Lord. Or you can just come out and be honest, and we can figure out what we're going to do from this moment forward. Well, let's just say that when darkness is exposed in your marriage, all hell breaks loose. And that's what happened in our marriage. And I was so devastated because when you walk down the aisle and you're 23 years old, you don't walk down thinking, well, maybe this will work. And if it doesn't, no big deal, we'll go on and do something else. No, because of my parents' example, I was marrying my soulmate. And I was marrying the man that I was going to grow old with and we raise our grandchildren together. If we're blessed, our great grandchildren together. And that wasn't meant to be. But I will say, I also would not have the passion that I have now through my foundation, Hammered Heart Foundation, or my Drewville, which you said we want to get to, Exhibit A. I wouldn't have the passion to do what I'm doing if I hadn't been through what I went through, because I didn't understand the devastation of divorce. I didn't understand, I had a momentary time in my life where he shut all the bank accounts and, closed everything, and I was penniless. And gratefully, mine was short lived, but there's a lot of women where it is not short lived, and it's catastrophic what it does to a family.
Wow. Wow. And so you survived that. And then Michael, I think in 2022, he died of a brain
Yes,
tumor.
glioblastoma, brain cancer. And
did he get right with the Lord before that? Like, what happened with?
a lot of people ask me, they say, do you think he's in heaven? And I said, well, first of all, nobody's the judge of that except for Jesus. But I will say this, he was a broken man, and we had never dealt with our issues. But I really know that he still loved Jesus. In the end, I would go into his hospital room or wherever he was. In Santa Barbara, I went to see him, and Los Angeles, all different places. And I would literally crawl in bed with him and lay hands on him and pray over him and ask Jesus to heal him. And sometimes it doesn't turn out exactly the way we think it should be, but Michael got his ultimate healing, and he is in heaven rejoicing. And I say, heck, he's better off than we are right now. So I know that he knew the Lord, because we would cry together and we would pray together. And one time I was playing worship music with him in bed and praying over him, and he said, Drew, I see angels. It was really beautiful. So yes, I would 100% say that he is in heaven with Jesus.
Wow, praise God.
Yes.
And so, before we get to Drewville and your other projects, as you say in the book, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Your son, Army Hammer, who obviously is a famous actor and in many movies, which I mentioned in the introduction. Talk about when Army became an actor. What were your thoughts?
Well, I was always the ever encouraging mother. And when he told me at 12 that he wanted to be an actor, I'm like, that's the worst job in the world. I go, why would you want to do that? Hollywood's so woke, and it's ridiculous. Well, we didn't even know what woke was back then, actually, but whatever it is. And I prayed. I said, God, if this is what you have for my son, who am I to poo-poo it? But, this is a tough one. And there are millions of people that come to Hollywood every year thinking they're going to be this, instantaneous star. And it doesn't work that way. Even Army beat the pavement for 7 years. But the first movie he booked, he played Billy Graham. And when I tell you, he became Billy Graham. I don't know if I'm sure you can still find it on Netflix or something, but it's called Billy the Early Years, and it's a very small independent film. It's not the big, production, but it is the sweetest movie. And his first movie, he carried the entire movie. I think he was in every scene. And we all flew out to Nashville when he was doing the scene where Billy Graham gave the sermon of his very first church service. And he kind of fumbled around because he was new. We all have to learn as we go along. And in the end, after he gives one of the exact sermons that Billy gave, he puts his hands out and he says, give your life to Christ. Well, I was a chocolate mess by then. And I'm like, okay, God, I'm sorry. This is got to be what you have for him. If this is his first movie and he's actually having an altar call in the movie, are you kidding me? And I tell him every day, I tell him a lot of things. Army, you literally do not have a chance in hell. praying mother, and I'm not stopping.
So what? Obviously, he was in Social Network. He played the Winklevoss twins. And tell us what your reaction was when you found out he was going to play this role, "Call Me by Your Name," with Timothy Chalamet, where he plays basically Timothy Chalamet's
Must we
coming
go
of
to
age.
that one?
Well,
Out of all the movies, we had to go to that one.
I just want to know your reaction when you found out this information.
Well, I went bat, you know what, crazy. It was not pretty, to be perfectly honest. And you know what? I'm going to say this because I was destroyed in the press because I did not want to go see that movie. And Army was on, Jay Leno or something and says, my mom won't see the movie. Well, I supported him in every movie, but there's a reason. And whether it's homosexual or heterosexual, I don't want to watch my son having sex or in bed with anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And just as he would get totally creeped out seeing his parents in bed having sex, right? So I don't want to watch that. But here's how I describe it. And again, I'm going to get killed in the press, but oh well, worse things have happened, right? Are we going to please God or man? But here's what I said to him. I go, let's talk about this script, because I asked him if I could read the script. I said, you are a young professor and you are probably 15 to 20 years older than the young man in Italy. I said, you have a girlfriend at home. So you go to Italy and you prey on this young kid that supposedly was 17, because that's the legal age in France, but he looked 13. So you are actually switching roles, because that's exactly what happened to you. You were preyed upon by an older young man, and that's been a real problem in your life. And
Right.
now you are that older man, and then let's take it a step further. Then let's go back to the States, propose to your girlfriend, and call him and tell him now you're engaged, the young boy, and destroy his life. So I said, let's do this. If Elizabeth was your girlfriend, that Elizabeth was his former wife, and you were dating, you went to Italy and you had a homosexual affair or even a heterosexual affair, and you don't tell her about it, and you go back and propose to her, do you think she would want to marry you? Would anybody marry you knowing that you had done that? So what Hollywood does is they twist the truth and they turn a lust movie into a love movie.
Right.
That's it in a nutshell.
So just to clarify, you just mentioned that Army, when he was young, he was molested by his youth pastor. That's
Yes. So I said, Army, how can you feel good about making a movie where now you are the predator? That young boy, again, he looked like he was 13, which is when it happened.
Timothy
to you.
Chalamet, yeah.
Yes. And now you are the predator. And you know how that destroyed your life temporarily, because I believe Jesus is healing him. But I said, how can you do that after knowing what you have been through? Well, Mom, I've played murders before, and I don't murder people. I said, this is different.
Yeah.
I just believe it is.
Yeah. And then fast forward to, Army has been through a lot in the last few years. How did you handle that when all the accusations about him came out? How did you handle that?
Well, it's the saying when it says a mother is as happy as her most happy child. And when you watch your son spiral and lose everything, looking back, Army will say, and he has said on Piers Morgan and his own podcast, that I can say now it's the greatest thing that ever happened to me, because he now has been sober 3.5 years. and he got out of that just crazy world of everything being thrown at you. And thankfully, he's already filmed a movie again. But when your family is going through something like that, you know, it's kind of like the Princess Di thing. When it's in public, it's even, you know, exacerbated, if you will.
Yeah.
You know, Army says that at one time during COVID, he was the number 3 person, the 3rd person in the world being Googled at the time. So I called him one day and I'm like, okay, you know, I'm hearing this cannibal thing. I go, just level with your mother. Are there any limbs missing? Are
By
there
the
any
way,
girls
he was
out there?
accused of being a cannibal and eating like his
Yes,
girlfriend's
sorry.
hands or whatever. But yeah,
Yeah,
go ahead.
ribs. Yeah, he
Ribs.
wrote some stupid text. Boy, does he learn not to put anything in text. But I said, you know, you wrote some dumb text, so you're dumb in that area. So smart otherwise. But I said, but are there any limbs missing? Are there any ribs gone out of any girl's body? No. And he starts laughing. I said, okay. He said, Mom, haven't you? I've heard you say before, oh my gosh, that baby is so cute. I could eat her up. He goes, but you're not going to eat that. I said, you're right. You're absolutely right. So the way I handled it is I did not want to write about it because it's not my story to tell. And Arnie refused to talk about it. He just disappeared because he said, I will never say a bad word. I'm just going to move on in my life and the truth always comes out. And of course, a couple times I wanted to call him and go, well, if you're not going to talk about it, can I? Because these girls stayed in my home. I mean, you know, these girls were madly in love with me. So can I talk? He's like, no, no. So anyways, he handled it way more than I was able. But it's so difficult when it spreads all over the newspapers. And I was even at a dinner party in DC, and this woman had no idea who I was. Rightfully so. Why should anybody know? And we were talking about how the world of Hollywood's being run now. And she goes, yeah, I like that effing Armie Hammer. He's an effing rapist. And I'm like, okay, this is not going down well. So, you know, and I thought, well, if they're talking about it at dinner parties, I can imagine what they're saying behind my back. But here's reality. Is when your name is out in public, it's just going to happen. You cannot control anyone's narrative. And I am not going to convince anybody. It's like if you're a Republican, nobody's going to convince anyone to be a Democrat or vice versa. But, you know, you have to come to that on your own. And it was probably one of the most difficult things. And I didn't want to write about it. But my editor said, Drew, it's the white elephant in the room. If it was your nephew or a friend's son, you don't have to talk about it. It is your son. So I really prayed about that chapter, and I sent it to both my sons because they were both going through things. My younger son had to handle a horrendous lawsuits with changed wills, you know how that goes. And I sent them copies, and Army and Victor wrote me back and said, we wouldn't change one thing. You know, write it, Mom, because I think you took a very fair approach. I was not one-sided. I was not, oh, my son's wonderful, never do anything like this. No, I say, he was not criminally wrong. He was morally wrong, and I didn't raise him that way. Yet, this is going to turn for good. So, and I pretty much went into detail, as you know.
Yeah, you did. And you guys pick up the book and you can read more about that. Now, let's end on this because you have several projects you're working on now, one of which is Drewville. Can you explain what that is?
Yes. So I started first with my foundation, and that's Drewville. The proceeds will be going into the Hammered Heart Foundation, where I help single moms who aren't making it, and I can't give to individuals. I give to ministries, and I have a Hammered Heart Fund in some churches where they help buy them gas cards or grocery cards or make sure they have Christmas gifts at Christmas. So Drewville kind of started organically because I have flipped now, I think it's 39 or 40 properties. And I just love the creative outlet. And Drewville, the name came from I decorate in all hot pinks and lime greens and lemon yellows and bright blues, very Palm Beach style. And my sons, I heard them one time tell their friends, yeah, well, we basically grew up in Whoville because I decorate that way. So I thought, well, I think Whoville's kind of apropos. So that's what I did. And I started a brand, and even at Christmas time, I'm doing Christmas packages so people can buy. I do these fabulous colored crosses, like big chunky paperweights, and I do necklaces, and I do the hand hearts. I have melamine, all sorts of different products, and the proceeds go back into my foundation because I want to do it the way my dad did it. Is I want to have a ministry, but I want to fund it from my businesses. So I never have to ask for offerings or anything like that. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, but that's just the way I saw it work with my dad, and that's the way I chose to do it. So my book can be sold on either Drewville or Amazon.com. And then I did an AI project, and it's called GetHope.ai. And you can ask over 1,000 questions about the Bible. What does the Bible say? Not according to Drew Hammer, but what does the Bible say? And then I also do a 365 journey that you can get off of Drewville or Hammered Heart or GetHope.ai. And I walk through the Bible in a year in less than 15 minutes a day. And I sell journals if you don't have the Bible, so you can follow the text with it. But it's just a fun way to go through the Bible, and I'm a little wacky, as you can tell on this podcast. So hopefully I bring a little humor into it and some fun.
But you're wacky for Jesus,
sides.
which I love. You're very wacky for Jesus.
Yes, I am. I am, much to my son's chagrin.
Yeah, when we had dinner, it was so much fun. Speaking of wacky, we ended up praying for our waiter, which was at this restaurant in Beverly Hills, which was probably the first time that's happened. So that was a very fun experience. So yeah, we'll link to those below, to those websites, to your website, and we'll leave it there. But Drew Hammer, thank you. And guys, the book is called Hammered. Pick it up. As Drew said, it's on Amazon or at, what'd you say, drewhammer.com?
Drewville.com.
Drewville.com. So pick up the book. Thank you for coming on the show, Drew.
Thank you for having me. I can't wait for our next dinner. That was so much fun.
I know. It was so fun. Thank you. God bless you guys. We'll see you next time.